She was 18 the winter her name stopped being her own. The season hunger carved the hills. Hollow and shame settled into her bones heavier than the snow, pressing down on the tin roof of her father's cabin. It was the kind of winter that erased futures quietly, without gunfire or shouting, the kind that decided a life's direction before dawn had fully burned the frost from the ground. When the man came riding up the frozen path with his mule and a sack of white flour slung across its back, she already knew. Before a single word was spoken, before boots hit the dirt, something inside her understood that a part of her life had just been bartered away. Her father did not look at her when the deal was made, not once. Not when the stranger's eyes lingered too long on her thin wrists, her sunken cheeks, the narrow slope of her shoulders. He measured her the way men measured cattle, not for beauty, not even for desire, but for usefulness. And when the sack hit the frozen ground with a dull, final thud, the sound echoed in her chest like a door slamming shut. Flour meant survival. Flour meant her younger siblings would eat. Flour meant her father would not have to listen to them cry, themselves to sleep with empty bellies. And in that brutal, desperate math, her worth was reduced to weight and grain, to calories and crumbs. No one asked if she agreed. She remembered her mother then, dead these 3 years now. Remembered the way her hands used to move through her hair, patient and gentle, braiding it by the firelight while the wind howled outside. Remembered her voice, soft but certain, saying a woman's value was not what she could be given away for, but what she had the strength to keep. The memory burned as her father's voice cracked, while he shook the stranger's hand. He said it was only work, only for a season, said she'd be safe, said the things men say when they are, lying to their own blood and praying the lie will hold long enough to keep them alive. When she climbed onto the wagon without crying, it wasn't because she was brave. It was because crying felt like a luxury they could no longer afford. Tears didn't fill bellies. Tears didn't stop winter. The road away from home stretched long and frozen, her breath fogging the air in pale bursts. The sack of flour swayed behind her with every jolt of the wagon, a cruel promise riding alongside her. And with every mile, she felt herself shrinking, folding inward, becoming smaller, quieter, easier to own. When the cabin finally disappeared behind the hills, she realized no one was coming to stop it. No one was calling her name. The world had decided what she was worth without ever bothering to hear her voice. The place she was taken was not a home. It was a claim, a spread of land ruled by men who spoke in orders and silences, where authority lived in clenched jaws and lowered brows. Women kept their eyes down and their hands busy. Questions were dangerous things there. She learned quickly that obedience was safer than resistance, that silence could act as a shield, that being invisible hurt less than being noticed the wrong way. So she worked. She endured. She folded herself thinner and thinner, telling herself it was temporary. Seasons change. Flour runs out. But dignity, once stripped away, does not return easily. Nights were the hardest. The wind moaned through the boards, sounding almost human, and she lay awake counting the cracks in the ceiling, tracing them like constellations she would never escape. She wondered if her father slept easier now, with full bellies under his roof. Wondered if he felt the weight of what he had traded. Wondered if she should hate him, forgive him, or forget him entirely just to stay sane. And it was on one of those nights, when hope felt like a dangerous, foolish thing, that she heard hooves outside. Voices followed, unfamiliar voices, deep and steady, not sharp with cruelty. For the first time in months, fear loosened its grip just enough for curiosity to draw breath. The rancher who came was not young. He was not gentle-looking either. His face was cut with lines earned from sun and years, his hands scarred, his posture solid, like land that had survived storms without ever asking permission to stand. When his eyes met hers, there was no hunger there. No sense of ownership, only something that startled her more than cruelty ever had: respect. When he spoke, it was to the men. Not over her head and not around. Her, clear, firm, he said he had come to settle a debt. Said he was there to take what was owed. Voices rose. Tempers flared. The air tightened. She stood frozen, heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard, until he did the unthinkable. He turned to her directly and asked her name. He didn't demand it. He asked. Her voice shook when she answered. because it had been so long since anyone had cared enough to hear it. In that fragile, trembling moment, something inside her dared to believe that maybe her story had not ended the day. She was exchanged for flour. Belief is a fragile thing when survival has been learned the hard way. As she followed him away from that place under a sky cracked open with winter light, she did not yet know if she was being saved or simply traded again. She did not yet know that worth can be returned, not through pity or rescue, but through choice, dignity, and the slow, stubborn rebuilding of a self someone tried to erase. As the ranch rose ahead, wide and quiet, honest in its loneliness, she clutched her coat tighter and whispered a promise to herself. If this world meant to break her again, it would have to try harder than before. Somewhere beneath the hunger and the shame, she was still a woman who remembered her mother's words. Still a girl who had been worth more than a sack of flour all along. The first thing she learned on the ranch was that silence there did not mean danger. It meant space. Space was something she had forgotten how to hold without fear. The rancher's name was Elias Cole, she would learn later, and he did not watch her the way men watch things they owned. His attention lived on the land, the sky, the cattle, the shifting signs of weather. When he spoke to her, it was never with commands, but with options. He told her where food was kept, where she could sleep, what work needed doing if she wished to do it. Every sentence carried a quiet truth that unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Because kindness demands something harder than obedience. It demands belief. She waited for the bargain to reveal itself. Waited for the moment his voice would harden, when the cost would finally be named. Days passed into weeks. The cost never came. Only steady routines, warm meals, the strange dignity of being trusted with small decisions. Did she prefer working in the barn or the kitchen? Coffee or tea in the mornings? Did she need a heavier coat before the wind rose? Each question stitched something back together inside her that hunger had torn apart. Worth does not return all at once. It creeps back in fragile increments. Some nights she woke shaking from dreams where she was still a commodity, still traded, still voiceless. Elias never asked her to explain those nights. He only left a lantern burning outside her door and pretended not to notice when she sat until dawn watching the light, teaching herself that safety could exist without being loud about it. The ranch hands treated her differently, too. Not because Elias ordered them to, but because the way a man lives teaches others how to behave. Respect has a gravity all its own. She worked. She learned. Her hands grew strong, not from desperation, but from purpose. When spring finally cracked the frozen ground open, she realized she had gone an entire season without flinching. At the sound of footsteps behind her, that truth settled deep, quiet, and powerful. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink low and red over the fields, Elias told her why he had come for her. He spoke of a sister lost to hunger and desperation, of a father who made a choice he never forgave himself for, of debts that could not be paid with money. Some wrongs, he said, demanded action. As he spoke, she understood something vital. He had not come to rescue her like a hero from a story. He had come to interrupt a pattern the world kept repeating. In that understanding, something stronger than gratitude took root. Recognition. She began to speak more, to laugh once, startled by the sound of it, as if it belonged to someone else. She remembered the girl she had been before a sack of flour replaced her name. When Elias offered her wages, real wages she could save, send home, or keep entirely for herself, she cried for the first time since leaving her father's cabin. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that her life now belonged to her again. Eventually, she chose to return home, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. When she stood in the doorway of the cabin where it had all begun, her father looked smaller than she, remembered, older, bent by regret and years of quiet shame. She did not throw his sin back at him. She did not excuse it either. She told him she was no longer for sale, that her value was not something hunger could erase. That forgiveness might be possible, but ownership never again would be. When she left him standing there with tears on his face, she felt lighter than she ever had. Closure does not always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from self-respect. She returned to the ranch not as someone taken in, but as someone choosing to stay. She built a life that grew honest and strong, like the land itself. When love came, slow and careful and earned, it was not rescue. It was partnership. rooted in the shared understanding that dignity is not given by others. It is protected by those who recognize it. Years later, when she told her story to a young girl who believed she was worth nothing because the world had priced her cheaply, she spoke the words that had once saved her. Your value was never in what they took from you. It was in what you survived and what you chose to become afterward. And the girl who had once been traded for flour stood tall on land she helped build, knowing without doubt that worth cannot be bought, sold, or bargained away. It can only be forgotten. And once remembered, it belongs to you forever. The days that followed did not arrive with ceremony. They came the way honest days always do, one after another, steady and unannounced. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains of the small room. Elias had shown her, catching dust in the air like suspended breath. She lay awake long before she needed to, listening. Not for danger, but because her body had not yet learned that it no longer needed to stand guard. Silence, in this place, was wide instead of sharp. It did not press in on her chest. It waited. When she finally rose, she moved carefully, as though the world might change its mind if she startled it. The floorboards creaked under her weight, not accusing, just old. She washed her face in cold water, watching the girl in the reflection blink back at her. She looked the same and not the same. Still thin, still pale, but there was something unguarded in her eyes that frightened her more than fear ever had. Hope, she had learned, could hurt worse than hunger if you let it grow without caution. Elias was already outside when she stepped into the morning. He stood near the fence line, hands resting easy on the wood, eyes tracking the movement of cattle across the pasture. He acknowledged her with a nod, nothing more. No expectation hung in the air. No demand followed her steps. The absence of pressure felt almost disorienting, like stepping onto solid ground after months at sea. She waited for him to tell her what to do. He didn't. After a moment, he said there was bread cooling in the kitchen, and, if she wanted work, the south barn could use cleaning. If she didn't, that was fine, too. Choice. The word settled heavy and unfamiliar. She chose the barn, not because she felt she had to, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind caught up to the idea that she was no longer being watched for mistakes. The work was honest and tiring. Dust coated her arms. Straw stuck to her skirts. By midday, her muscles ached in a way that felt earned, not punished. When she finished, Elias thanked her. The word hit harder than any blow she had ever taken. She nodded and looked away, afraid of what might show on her face if she let herself feel it fully. Days stretched. Patterns formed. Meals were taken at regular hours. Sleep came easier, though not without interruption. The nightmares lingered, stubborn things that did not recognize new borders. She woke some nights with her heart racing, the echo of men's voices still ringing in her ears. Each time the lantern burned outside her door, steady and patient. Elias never asked. He never hovered. He simply made it known in the quiet way that mattered most, that she was not alone unless she chose to be. The ranch hands were cautious at first, curious but careful. They took their cues from Elias, who treated her presence like a fact of weather rather than a spectacle. When she spoke, they listened. When she passed, they stepped aside without making a show of it. Respect, she learned, did not always need enforcement. Sometimes it spread naturally from the center outward. As winter loosened its grip, the land changed. Snow receded. Mud gave way to grass. Calves were born in the early mornings, their cries thin but determined. She helped where she could, surprising herself with how quickly she learned. There was satisfaction in competence, in being useful without being used. She felt herself filling out, not just in body, but in spirit. Her laughter came again, tentative at first, like a sound she had forgotten how to make. One evening, after a long day mending fence, Elias sat beside her on the porch without ceremony. The sky was wide and streaked with color, the sun sinking low and slow. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he told her about his sister. He did not dress the story in pretty words. Hunger, cold, a father's choice that could not be undone, regret that lasted longer than grief. He spoke plainly, like a man who had learned that truth carried more weight than comfort. She listened, understanding threading itself through her chest. This was not charity. This was reckoning. When he finished, he did not look at her for approval. He looked at the land. She realized then that what he had offered her was not salvation, but interruption, a refusal to let the same story end the same way again. That knowledge settled something restless inside her. She was not an object of pity. She was a person whose life had been redirected by another's deliberate choice. When Elias told her she would be paid for her work, she could not speak at first. The idea of wages, real money with no hidden claim attached, overwhelmed her. She took the coins with shaking hands, the weight of them unfamiliar and grounding. That night she cried quietly into her pillow, grief and relief tangled together until she could not tell where one ended and the other began. The thought of home crept in slowly, not as obligation, but as a question she allowed herself to ask. When she finally decided to return, Elias did not argue. He only said the door would remain open, whatever she chose. The journey back felt different than the one that had taken her away. She traveled with her spine straighter, her breath deeper. When she reached the cabin, her father stood in the doorway like a man braced for judgment. She gave him neither absolution nor cruelty, only truth. When she left again, it was with something precious intact. Herself. Returning to the ranch felt like coming into alignment rather than retreat. She stayed. She built. She chose. Love, when it arrived, did not announce itself loudly. It grew in shared mornings, in mutual respect, in the quiet understanding that neither of them owned the other. Years later, when she told her story, she did not speak of rescue. She spoke of remembering. And remembering, she knew now, was the first and hardest act of freedom. Time on the ranch did not rush her, and in that unhurried rhythm, she began to feel parts of herself return that she had not known were missing. Mornings came with purpose instead of dread. She woke to the sound of wind moving through grass, to the distant lowing of cattle, to the creak of the house settling into the day. The body remembers safety slowly, and she learned to let it. Some habits did not leave easily. She still startled at raised voices, still positioned herself near doorways without thinking, still measured every kindness for the cost she feared might follow. But the cost never came, and little by little the constant readiness eased. She took pride in the work. Real pride, not the brittle kind born from survival, but the solid satisfaction of doing something well because it mattered. She learned how to read the sky for weather, how to spot illness in a horse before it showed in the legs, how to mend what was broken without making it weaker in the process. Elias noticed, though he never praised her in ways that felt heavy. A nod, a quiet acknowledgement, trust given without fanfare. It made her stand straighter than compliments ever could. There were moments, unexpected and sharp, when the past reached up and grabbed at her. A stranger riding too close to the fence, the smell of flour dust when bread was baked, the sound of a sack hitting the ground in the storehouse. Each time she reminded herself where she was, who she was now. She learned that strength was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it decide her future. The ranch hands came to see her not as an exception, but as part of the place itself. She shared meals with them, stories when the evenings ran long. They spoke of weather and cattle and the slow changes of the land. No one spoke of her past unless she did, and she rarely did. Not because she was ashamed, but because it no longer defined the shape of her days. Her life was no longer a single wound she had to keep explaining. Elias remained steady, unchanged by seasons or circumstance. He was a man built of patience, the kind that had nothing to prove. When disagreements came, they were handled without shouting, without threats. She watched how he dealt with others and understood that respect was not something he performed. It was something he practiced. In quiet moments, she caught him watching the horizon, carrying the weight of things he had never said. It made her feel less alone in her own silences. As months turned, something between them shifted, subtle and careful. It did not announce itself with longing or promises. It grew in shared work, in conversations that lingered a little longer than necessary. In the easy way, they fell into step beside one another without thinking. She noticed how he waited for her opinion, how he adjusted plans when she spoke, how her presence altered the shape of his days as naturally as his had altered hers. It was not rescue, it was recognition. When he asked her one evening if she intended to stay through the winter, the question was gentle, unweighted. She answered honestly that she did not know. The answer surprised her with its truth. For the first time in her life, The future was not something being decided for her. It was something open, wide, and uncertain. Elias accepted her answer without disappointment. He told her uncertainty was not weakness. It was possibility. She thought often of her father during that time. Not with bitterness, but with a distant sadness that did not demand resolution. She sent money when she could. Not as payment, not as forgiveness, but because she chose to. Choice, she learned, changed the meaning of everything. She did not return often. When she did, she stood taller in the doorway, no longer shrinking to fit the space where she had once been diminished. Her father spoke less. His eyes carried regret he could never quite set down. She did not take it from him. Some burdens are not meant to be shared. Winter came again, but it was not the winter that had broken her. It was a different season entirely. Cold still came, hunger still existed in the world, but it no longer defined her place within it. She worked, earned, slept without fear of footsteps in the night. On the coldest evenings, she sat by the fire with Elias, sharing stories that did not circle pain but acknowledged it as something survived. When he laughed, it surprised her how deeply the sound settled into her, how natural it felt to be part of someone else's quiet joy. When love finally found a name between them, it was spoken without urgency. No claim was laid. No future demanded. It was an understanding, mutual, and careful, rooted in the knowledge that neither of them needed saving. They chose one another, and in that choice, something rare and strong took hold. She did not lose herself in it. She did not give herself away. She stood beside him, equal and unafraid. Years passed, measured not in loss but in growth. The ranch prospered. She took on more responsibility, more authority. Her voice carried weight, and she learned to use it without apology. When younger women came through, uncertain and worn thin by the world, she met them with the same quiet respect that had once been given to her. She did not promise them safety. She showed them how to build it. One evening, long after the fear had loosened its hold, she stood outside under a wide sky and thought of the girl she had been. The girl who climbed onto a wagon without crying because tears were too expensive. She did not mourn her. She honored her. Survival had been her first act of defiance. Living fully was the second. When she told her story now, she did not soften it. She did not make it easier to hear. But she told it with her head high, not as a confession, but as a testament. And those who listened understood something important. The world may try to name you by what it takes, but the truest name you carry is the one you claim for yourself. The years did not blur the way she once feared they might. They sharpened instead, each season adding definition to a life that had once been reduced to survival alone. The ranch changed with her. Fences were rebuilt straighter. Fields were rotated smarter. Decisions were made with foresight instead of desperation. She learned that stability was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of control over one's own response to it. That knowledge settled deep, becoming instinct. She and Elias never rushed what grew between them. There was no single moment that declared everything different. Love arrived the way dawn does on the plains. Gradual, undeniable only once it was fully there. They spoke of it plainly when it finally needed words, without promises that felt like chains, without fear that speaking it would somehow break it. Their bond was built on shared labor and shared silence, on the understanding that neither of them needed ownership to feel secure. They chose each other every day, and the choosing mattered more than any vow. The ranch became a place others noticed for reasons that went beyond cattle or land. Travelers spoke of its fairness. Hands stayed longer than they did elsewhere. Word spread that it was a place where people were treated like people. She saw younger women arrive wary and thin-skinned, carrying the same guarded posture she once wore. She did not overwhelm them with kindness or questions. She gave them space, options, the same quiet respect that had once unsettled her. Watching them straighten over time became one of her greatest sources of pride. Sometimes late at night, memory still came uninvited, not with the force it once had, but with a dull ache that reminded her where she had been. She did not push it away. She let it pass through her, acknowledging that survival leaves marks that do not vanish simply, because life improves. The difference now was that the memories no longer owned her. They informed her. They made her careful with power, deliberate with trust. When her father eventually died, she attended the burial without ceremony. There were no speeches that needed to be made, no reckonings left unfinished. She stood quietly, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only a distant sorrow for a man crushed by a choice he could not undo. She had already claimed the only thing that mattered, herself. Leaving the grave, she felt no pull backward. The past had its place, but it no longer dictated the road ahead. As she grew older, her voice grew steadier. When she spoke, people listened, not because she demanded it, but because experience had earned it. She negotiated contracts. She settled disputes. She refused deals that felt wrong, no matter how profitable they appeared. Hunger had taught her the cost of desperate decisions. Dignity had taught her the value of walking away. One afternoon, a young girl arrived with a family passing through, her eyes downcast, her hands clenched tight around the edge of her coat. The girl watched her the way she once watched other women, measuring, learning, hoping without daring to name it. Later, when they were alone, the girl whispered that she thought she wasn't worth much, that the world had already decided that for her. She listened without interruption. Then she told the girl the truth, not gently but honestly. Your value was never in what they took from you. It was in what you survived and what you chose to become afterward. The girl's shoulders lifted just a fraction, but it was enough. She recognized the moment for what it was. The passing of a torch she had never asked for, but carried all the same. Standing on the porch years later, watching the land stretch wide and patient under the sky, she felt no need to prove anything. The girl who had once been traded for flour was gone, not erased, but transformed. In her place stood a woman who understood that worth cannot be bought, sold, or bargained away. It can only be forgotten. And once remembered, it belongs to you forever.